Welcome to this series in which I travel down the nostalgic lane of classic MMORPGs to revisit the reasons why they captured our hearts. Subscribe for more MMO content, and thank you to all my viewers, including you, for making this possible. Leave a like if you enjoy the video, and leave a comment detailing why you loved EverQuest. Timestamps are included in the video's description with links to classic EQ servers for your convenience. Sound effects are bubbles of nostalgia. Here are a few. Let me know which memories they bring up. In fact, A Loving Robot, a former EverQuest developer who is currently making a modern MMO inspired by classic EverQuest that I've published about, interviewed the original composer, J. Barbeau. It's worth watching if you're a superfan. Regardless, the ambience of the various zones enhanced your immersion by storytelling through a melodic journey. The soundscape for Greater Fadark was nearly diametrically opposed to Nectilus Forest, despite both being inhabited by elves and being woodland wilderness. Or does the combat theme still send a surge of adrenaline through your veins? While the adrenaline is still pumping, remember reading the words, "Train!" I remember reading that term as a level 5 Wood Elf warrior. Yeah, don't make fun of me. And having not the faintest clue as to what a train meant. Did Norath have railroads? The gnomes were inventive after all. Was it a transportation system akin to teleportation? 30 seconds later, I see intrepid adventurers running from Orc Hill, followed by a dozen brazen, crushbone shamans and brutes. Ah, that is what a train is. It's a long link of aggressive mobs, with the players being the locomotive and the mobs being the pulled cars. In fact, this PvE phenomena finds representation by others as it was a defining component to gameplay. In other words, early EverQuest was hard, and by hard I mean so difficult that only a few classes could solo, and even they had to be careful. Many mobs would attack you on sight, and of these creatures, many roamed around the zones, either in a patrol or seemingly randomly. This meant that very few areas were safe, because a creature could wander right into your camp. Those who played early EverQuest would remember that players set up dedicated farming spots called camps, to which a chosen puller would lure back mobs, typically one at a time, for the entire group to fight. Oftentimes, single mobs were tuned to be fought by entire groups. Crowd control and support were more or less a requirement for efficient success. A single ad could wipe an entire group. While modern MMOs tend to have these fights as bosses at the end of instant dungeons, each mob in EverQuest was comparatively as difficult. Bards and enchanters were particularly useful in such circumstances, although druids could tame dangerous beasts too. Shamans were sought after for their immensely useful buffs that could make the difference between life and death. Another component of the open world group-based gameplay was that the game did not force groups to need 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS roles. Are only a mage, necromancer, and a ranger available? Great, that's what you have to work with to make your next session of gameplay work. I remember playing in a small group of only Shadow Knights. We simply would take turns tanking while the others stole life back to full, and we'd repeat the cycle. This made playing through the same content feel fresh, because the tools with which you have to solve problems changed. To demonstrate analogously, Ash Sohn, a professional drummer, overlays various time signatures over the same chord progression. The sense of newness, despite being intimately familiar, is the same type of feeling we experience when playing in desperate group configurations. Take a listen. Thus, creative problem solving was required by players to meet the demand for each emergent situation. Difficulty bred cooperation, and when players worked together, or even against one another, communities formed. difficult PvE was not the only influence that enabled early EverQuest to be as communal as its reputation suggests. There were other systems by which players were encouraged to interact. Doing so was often safer, cheaper, and quicker than being a loner. Remember requesting ports to wizard spires or druid rings? To the unfamiliar, higher level druids and wizards could teleport their entire groups to specific zones, yet these often didn't overlap. Thus you'd hire one class to go to zone A while the other to zone B. Or let's say you were too cheap to buy a port. Recall taking the boat from Caledon to Freeport? Not only did you have to wait at the docks for the boat to arrive, yet you also had to physically navigate the Timor Steep on the ship with other players who took the journey with you. I recall many times enjoying the tavern in the bowels of the ship. Or who can't fondly recall the marketplace in the East Common Lands tunnels? For the uninitiated, there were tunnels that connected North Row to the newbie area of Dark Elves, humans, and many other races. It was a natural nexus of player activity. As a newcomer, you were able to see what classes looked like, which abilities they had in the later game, and get a sense of the economy while networking. In a way, it was a player-made vertical slice of the constructed social web connecting players together. In fact, keeping players together was a core element of the classic EverQuest experience. As far as I know and remember, there was no sharding or instancing technology used to separate players. You historians can correct me here if I'm erroneous. The lack of instancing not only brought players together in both cooperative and competitive environments, yet it also safeguarded the supply and demand chain of progression. What I mean is, if a boss mob is instanced, then any player who has access to that instance can kill the boss. Thus, if 10,000 players qualify, that boss spawns and dies 10,000 times. But if that boss only spawns in a shared zone, then those 10,000 players have to negotiate their access to the single version of that boss. This became more prevalent during the in-game raiding scene, in which top guilds had to secure access to EverQuest's most difficult encounters. Now, not using instances did create second and third order problems, and this isn't necessarily a fully committed defense of EverQuest's implementation. But the benefit of doing so, i.e. not using instances, was to bring players together, even if they weren't cooperative. It's difficult not to bring up the economy after mentioning player activity. While there were DLL dupes and abuses, from a typical player perspective, the economy felt reasonably fine-tuned during the classic era, that I'm defining as pre-Lechlan and especially pre-Planes of Power. Early on, you're selling insect wings and rusty swords for a few copper or silver pieces each, which teaches you how valuable certain items are. I recall seeing people selling HP rings for hundreds of platinum when I only had a few gold coins to spare. But this was just the beginning. As a new player, you learned that bat wings or skeleton bones were valuable to higher level druids or necromancers and shadow knights, respectively, so you could prioritize fighting undead or winged mammals to augment your enrichment. Or you could remember that cracked staves sold for nearly a platinum each, so instead of filling your bags with rusty swords, you prioritized based on the game's feedback. The next step was learning about name spawns in various zones, which tended to drop unique loot. You could either farm to sell, assuming they were tradable, or you could sell the kill by camping the named boss and selling access to your party. This was really just the beginning of the economic framework of EverQuest. It was a glorious sandbox, and I wish that modern MMOs would take more direct inspiration from it. Regarding a sandbox, the game's world was as linear as a fractal. Zones were not a drive-through in which players transitioned through them sequentially. Instead, they were a bendable fabric of encounters suitable for many different ranges of levels. More than that, they were memorable. How many times did I fall from Kelethon to splatter on the forest floor of Fadar? Or how many times did the gals guarding the undead quarter in Neriac send shivers down my spine? Or realize how deeply the ogres hated the dwarves by hanging one of them as a trophy in their city square? Moreover, so-called newbie zones often had extraordinarily difficult creatures, either in them or adjacent to them. For example, one of the original in-game raid bosses, the Dragon Lord Nagafin, was only 2 zones away, 2 from the newbie zone of the Dark Elves. Or in the East Common Lands, 1 zone away from the newbie human or Dark Elves resided an exceptionally powerful griffin, which roamed across the zone to feed on unscrupulous adventurers. Or the Sand Giant, another zone away, or Lord Divin and Crushbone, the list goes on. The brilliance of this system was twofold. Number 1, the world mattered. You had to pay attention, you had to understand where you and others were. And number 2, it blended level ranges together. There were reasons to return to zones closer to cities because there didn't really exist a concept of a starter or a newbie zone. since they could be near a high-level area or contain mid to end-game mobs. Thus, early EverQuest was a virtual cosmos. It was truly a world first and a game second. But before you could engage in the world, you had to pick a race and a class. While ultimately, race could be a cosmetic decision, early in the game it affected quite a bit. Faction standings, whether you could bash, could you see in the dark, how much could you carry, etc. By mid-game, these concerns were largely squared away and resolved. However, some classes were limited to particular races. There were 14 bona fide classic classes. No copies, no redundancies. Each had their own set of pros and cons, plus niches in which they could excel. While I could talk endlessly about each class, I'll highlight my favorites here, yet please tell me what your favorite class was in Classic EverQuest. In no particular order of importance, the Druid felt like an arbiter of natural power. You could heal, damage over time, crowd control, buff, and port almost anything but tank. This enabled very savvy Druids to be able to solo several mobs simultaneously through clever uses of slows and DOTs on mobs while boosting their own speed. At this point, bards deserve an honorable mention, since they were the king of DOT trains. In fact, they could clear entire zones. While arguably overpowered, their unique song-bending mechanic functionally enabled multiple spells to be cast simultaneously, and it was glorious to see. Enchanters were the masters of deception and benders of reality, who possessed some of the best haste and crowd control in the entire game. They were rather squishy, and their pet often got in the way, but their ability to control the battlefield was unparalleled. Through illusions, they could take the form and qualities of other races. Needed to enter Neriac as a dark elf, yet you're a high elf? No problem. Need HP regen? Throw on a troll illusion. Need to breathe underwater? Become a water elemental. My personal favorite was the Shadow Knight. In particular, I remember soloing red Aviacs in the southern plains of Karana by slowing, DOTing, and fearing them while my pet and I mowed them down. Red mobs were those whose level was so high above your own that the game implied that by merely engaging in combat against them would result in certain death. Doing so is dangerous, yet equally as fun and rewarding. Of course, danger was often contextually experienced in combat. Despite the lack of modern and conventional mechanics, which typically are scripted dance moves players must learn to master in order to defeat a boss, combat in EverQuest was arguably even more nuanced than modern titles. The pace of fights were slower, and thus gave more opportunity to players to use the fourth dimension as a resource for their advantage. This, however, also meant that mobs had more occasions to land a critical strike or use a harmful spell. Each miss was disappointing, yet each successfully landed blow moved you ever closer to victory. When you could learn to double attack, your damage output quickly moved to about double of what it was, which aided both your survival chances and farming efficiency. If you were a caster and were in melee, you had to keep in mind a few vectors. Number one, you had to ensure your skill in each school of magic was sufficiently leveled because if it wasn't, you ran the risk of fizzling, i.e. failing to cast the spell. This cost you both mana and time, something mages had very little of in the heat of melee. Number two, you had to time your cast between the swings of your opponents due to the risk of being interrupted. This created a dance effect by which skilled casters could weave their spells between the strikes of their foes. Number three, you had to stay still to cast. While controversial now, this decision required the caster to make a definitive choice to cast a spell based on when and where they were in relationship to the target. Bards were a hybrid jack-of-all-trades class that could effectively cast spells, in other words, play songs, while moving. There were mechanical idiosyncrasies, such as strafing without a weapon being equipped that added to your base run speed that, when also applied against slows against mobs and run speed boosts to your own character, made kiting safer and more effective. You could also use melee hits against you to your own advantage, if you could also have a damage shield cast upon you. These are just the tip of the iceberg, and another reason why I loved EverQuest. Ironically, EverQuest didn't have a lot of quests. In fact, the game didn't even tell you about any of them. There were no markers, no indicators, no signal that any particular NPC had something for you to do. While this arguably was an oversight, it was accidental genius. The word quest etymologically is tied to querere, Latin for to seek out. EverQuest actually did this by forcing players into the wilderness to band together and establish their own personal goals. With that said, while there were quests not worth doing, some certainly were, and interacted with other topics already covered. You could turn in crush bone bells to a dwarf in Kaladin for a massive amount of experience as a lobby. Some rich characters would power level their alts this way by simply buying belts from those who had farmed them. But this so-called quest wasn't a single turn-in. You could do it repeatedly until you were out of its level range. Epic quests were truly that, and an entire video could be made about them, some of which required entire guilds to participate. At the end, you'd receive a symbol of your strength, accomplishment, and cooperation with players. I remember seeing the flaming sword of a paladin and feeling deep jealousy. But to obtain that flaming blade, you had to develop your character. As you progress through the world, you also experience the so-called hell levels. These were mere tests of grit to determine if you'd simply give up. These were EverQuest versions of buds training for US Navy SEALs. They sucked. They weren't really fun. The reward for completing them was actually just being able to say that you completed them. But that was actually special. One reason being a Navy SEAL is extraordinary is because very few who even attempt to undergo the training make the choice not to quit. Being able to say that you kept saying yes in the face of seemingly impossible adversity is powerful. Moving through these hell levels and into the late game could be emotional for players too, since achieving maximum level was laborious and oftentimes difficult. The feeling reminds me of the scene in which a woman receives her black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Obviously, earning a black belt in a bona fide martial art is vastly more difficult than getting to level 50 in classic EverQuest. With that said, the actual feeling of accomplishment, having done so, was visceral and meaningful. Each ding was impactful since every bit of advantage was needed to progress. Wanting to enjoy a MMORPG vicariously through video instead of playing one? I've been there too. To satiate your thirst, here's more MMO content just for you. Thanks for watching.